The most significant impact of the first Trump administration, and indeed the aspect of it that may have the most long-lasting ramifications for American society, was its impact on the federal judiciary. During his first term in office, Donald Trump appointed a third of the United States Supreme Court to their lifetime appointments. Within a few years, the court overturned three major precedents, including Roe v. Wade. It also gutted affirmative action, and with its ruling on presidential immunity, it essentially made the office of the president above the law. And that's not all. During the first Trump administration, stocking the lower federal courts with movement conservatives was also a priority. And the Trump administration worked with the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, and Senate Republicans to name 234 federal judges, a move that has completely reshaped the federal judiciary. So, with Donald Trump back in office and Republicans holding a clear majority in the Senate, Republicans are salivating at the idea of dominating the judiciary for decades to come. In terms of the high court, all eyes are on the two oldest conservative justices, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. They are both septuagenarians, and if they retire, Donald Trump would have the opportunity to nominate their successors, making Trump the first president since Franklin Roosevelt to have appointed a majority of the justices to the high court. The 74-year-old Alito poured some cold water on this speculation this week when sources close to him told the Wall Street Journal he has no plans to retire. Despite these disclaimers, though, it seems like some SCOTUS hopefuls are nonetheless polishing their resumes. In a recent interview with the Volokh Conspiracy, a law and public policy blog, Judge James Ho of the Fifth Circuit expressed skepticism of birthright citizenship, perhaps reflecting Donald Trump's campaign promise to end birthright citizenship. Regardless of who sits on the high court, the change in the presidential administration will certainly impact the cases presented to the court. Under the new Trump administration, the federal government is likely to change its position on a number of cases that the court will hear this term, including cases involving the rights of transgender minors, issues involving ghost guns, and immigration. And on Thursday, Donald Trump announced that John Sauer will be his choice for Solicitor General. That's the lawyer who represents the United States government before the Supreme Court. Sauer is the lawyer who represented Trump in his immunity case before the court. He also argued for Trump in a New York appellate court in Trump's attempt to overturn the $454 million judgment obtained in the civil fraud case brought by New York Attorney General Letitia James. To break all of this down and to kick off this hour, we have Molly Jong-Fast, MSNBC political analyst and the host of the Fast Politics podcast and a special correspondent for Vanity Fair. Also with us is Mark Joseph Stern, a senior writer covering the courts and law at Slate. And finally, last but not least, Leah Litman, a professor of law at the University of Michigan and my co-host at the Strict Scrutiny podcast. Mark, you first. If either Alito or Thomas step down, they would be replaced by younger conservatives, but that wouldn't really shift the balance on the court. What would the impact be on these new nominations if they should happen on a court that's already pretty far to the right?
So first of all, and most obviously, it would lock in the conservative majority for something like 20 to 30 more years. You know, as you mentioned, Alito and Thomas are fairly old, but Trump would be looking to put someone in his 40s or early 50s in their place. That would mean that we would spend another generation, almost certainly, with at least 5 and quite possibly 6 conservatives in charge of this court. It would mean that Democratic dreams of shifting the court back to the center, or even back a little bit center-left, would vanish more or less overnight. And there would be, I think, also a kind of new gravitational center on the court. You know, Alito and Thomas are happy to kind of be in dissent or on their own on the fringe right wing. They don't try to build coalitions. They don't work very hard to bring other justices on board. I think having younger, like Gen X justices who would work with Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh could potentially shift the court rightward just by creating a new dynamic where instead of having Alito and Thomas bitter and angry and expressing their extremism and solo opinions, you might have 5 or 6 justices all willing to join together and shift the court rightward because, you know, when they're in their 50s, they're all speaking the same language. They all came up in the same Federalist Society milieu. They have a shared vision that they're going to pursue together.
Leah, let's talk a little bit about the Biden administration. One of the key points that the Biden administration did was to try and counteract what the Trump administration had done with judicial nominations. And right now, there are currently about 20 or so judicial nominations that are pending at the Senate. Can the Democrats push these nominations through during this lame duck period? And if they aren't successful in doing so, what will be the consequences?
They absolutely can if they grow a backbone and are willing to do so. I think it's extremely important for them to fill the vacancies because, of course, if they don't, they're handing them over to Donald Trump. And we know the kind of appointees that Donald Trump has been stacking the judiciary with. You know, one of the judges he appointed during the lame duck session of his last presidency was Eileen Cannon, who basically stymied the obstruction of justice and interference with classified documents charges case against him in Florida. Another was Matthew Kacsmaryk, who, of course, ordered judicially a nationwide ban on medication abortion, 2 years into the Biden administration. So it would be catastrophic if the Biden administration were to leave these vacancies open for the Trump administration. And I think that's particularly true for the district courts in the District of Columbia, which, of course, is the court where a lot of litigation against the government is brought. And if Biden allowed Donald Trump to fill vacancies in the District Court of District of Columbia, which, again, is really the seat for a lot of litigation against the government, that would be really, really bad.
Speaking of really, really bad, Molly, Trump has tapped John Sauer to be his Solicitor General. And Sauer, you'll recall, was the one who argued the presidential immunity case for Donald Trump at the Supreme Court. In fact, he was a lawyer who was asked if the president could be criminally prosecuted for ordering the assassination of a political rival. And here's his answer. Take a listen.
Could a president who ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival who was not impeached, would he be subject to criminal prosecution?
If he were impeached and convicted first. And
so your answer is no.
My answer is qualified yes.
That was Sauer arguing at the D.C. Circuit on behalf of Trump. But what do you make of this, Molly? What are your thoughts on this nomination? This is the lawyer who's going to represent the federal government before the court.
At least he's a lawyer, right? I mean, some of these cabinet members are not, RFK Jr. is not a doctor. Look, this is where we are. And I think there's only so many opportunities for America to kind of protect itself, and they just have to sort of figure out the people who are going to be the most, disturbing to the apple cart. I think that, this guy, I mean, ideologically not a match, but, there are only so many choices, and some of these appointments really will end the federal agency they're being tasked to run.
So, Leah, John Sauer, as Solicitor General, will have the authority to represent the federal government at the Supreme Court and to shape the administration's positions before the court. There are a number of cases already that are pending before the court this term that involve the federal government. How will this change in administration affect the litigation that is currently ongoing, including cases like United States versus Skermeti, the gender-affirming care to minors case that will be heard at the court in December?
Whenever there's a change in administration, the new administration can always indicate to the court that they are changing positions from the last administration, and we should expect the Trump administration to do so, particularly in the case you just noted, which involves the ban on gender-affirming care for minors. Of course, the Trump campaign and many Republican campaigns this last cycle largely ran on a campaign of bashing transgender individuals. So the Biden administration had asked the Supreme Court to review a lower court decision that had largely upheld the ban on gender-affirming care. It's highly unlikely that the Trump administration will continue that position. So I would expect Sauer, if he is confirmed as Solicitor General, to quickly note the change in the administration's position there. And Sauer is no stranger to taking extreme positions. When he was Solicitor General of Missouri, he filed a motion to intervene in the complaint in the Supreme Court to overturn the 2020 election. So now that could very well end up being the position of the federal government before the Supreme Court.
Mark, this court actually served as a bulwark during the first Trump administration. And to be clear, it's a differently constituted court. It was a 5-4 bare conservative majority. Now it's a 6-3 conservative supermajority. What are the prospects of this court serving as a restraint on executive power in this second Trump administration? Is that even on the table, or do you think all is lost?
I would say the prospects of that are pretty dismal, Melissa. This is a court that has consistently blocked Biden's policies, not on really articulated legal grounds, but on the principle that it's too much, it's too big, it's too progressive. We can't let the president do that. And yet consistently under Trump allowed the White House to push through extreme policies, including the entry ban on travelers from Muslim countries. I think that we will see a similar kind of schizophrenia in the court on January 20th when the White House flips from Biden back to Trump. I think that, these doctrines that the conservative justices made up out of thin air as a pretext to stymie the Biden agenda, like the major questions doctrine, I think they're just going to go away. And this court will greenlight and rubber stamp everything Trump wants, or almost everything Trump wants, because Trump and this court are very much in deep ideological alignment with each other. They want the country to move in the same direction, and they will interpret this election as a mandate for both institutions, both the presidency and the judiciary, to push as hard as possible. Legal constraints be damned.